screen, sir.
Yes.
That's you shooting him?
Yes.
Can you admit that you shot him in cold blood?
Yes.
You just hear gunshots. Pop, 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 pop. By the time I got over here with the crowd, the police was pulling up. When they ran in, you heard about another 17 gunshots.
We've learned the two employees killed are Brandon Gales and Anthony Brown. Both were fathers whose children will never see them alive again.
Before his name made headlines, most people in Southaven barely even knew Martez Abram. He lived quietly, worked steadily, and never drew attention. Nothing about him hinted at the kind of story that would later unfold and leave a town shaken with two families forever changed. The records, the testimonies, the footage, they all tell what happened that day. But they still can't explain the why. Why a man who lived so quietly for so long decided that, in one violent morning, everything had to burn. The jury took 55 minutes to decide Martez Abram should die.
It took jurors less than an hour to find Abram guilty on all 3 counts, 2 for capital murder and 1 for attempted murder.
That's less time than it takes to watch an episode of a TV drama, less time than most people spend eating dinner. On December 1st, 2022, after sitting through 3 days of testimony, 12 people watched surveillance footage of Abram shooting his co-workers, heard him admit to it on the stand, and decided he was guilty of 2 counts of capital murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The next day, December 2nd, they voted unanimously that he should be executed for it. Current District Attorney Robert Morris told reporters afterward that he didn't take death sentences lightly.
But from the first day that this unit started working on this case, it was never about the defendant. It was about the victims. And that's what this trial was about this week, was to protect and to serve the victims and to make sure that they got justice. So I'm extremely satisfied with the outcome. I also want to say that if it weren't for the quick response of the Southaven Police Department and the Horn Lake Police Department, this would have been a much bigger trial.
But this was the most egregious case he'd ever prosecuted because of how methodically Abram had planned the murders. However, the conviction came 3 years after the actual shooting, which meant Abram had spent 3 years in custody thinking about what he'd done and preparing for trial. When his lawyers put him on the stand in November 2022, it was a calculated risk because it gave prosecutors direct access to question him while the jury watched every reaction, every word, every moment of hesitation. The gamble didn't pay off. When prosecutors played surveillance video from July 30th, 2019, showing him shooting his managers, he broke down in court. When they asked if that was him on the footage, he admitted he'd shot both Anthony Brown and Brandon Gales and injured a Southaven police officer during the escape attempt.
Stop. Mr. Gale is on the floor going down at this point, isn't he?
Yes.
Okay, and that's you shooting him, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But then something strange happened with Abram's memory, or at least what he claimed to remember. When prosecutors pushed him on the details of what happened that morning, he said his memory went blank and told the court he remembered running into the store and he remembered running out, but everything in between was just a blur of movement and sound. He said he didn't even know if it was really him doing those things. And a moment later, like reality had crashed back into his brain, he admitted to his attorney that he was responsible for shooting those men and setting the fire. But the prosecution had physical evidence that made Abram's selective memory irrelevant. Police had found a handwritten to-do list in his possession after they had arrested him. The list laid out his plan in simple steps. Fill gas thing, get rented car, get gas and fill container, be there at 5:30 in the morning. And he had followed his own instructions precisely. He'd rented a Kia Soul from Memphis International Airport and left his personal vehicle, a Chevrolet Silverado, parked there with additional firearms locked inside. The rental car was loaded with multiple guns, extra ammunition magazines, a hunting knife, and body armor. He'd filled 2 one-gallon jugs with gasoline before driving to the Walmart. One jug he used inside the store to start the fire, the other he kept in the car as backup in case the first one didn't create enough destruction. When prosecutors asked him why he'd assembled this arsenal, he tried to frame it as self-defense and said that he acquired the firearms because of safety concerns due to previous problems at work and someone breaking into his car. that he'd never owned guns before but had reached a point where he was genuinely scared something bad was going to happen to him. Well, that explanation might have carried some weight if he'd bought a single handgun for protection and left it at that. But when you're wearing military-style body armor, carrying multiple weapons with extra magazines, and hauling gasoline for arson, the self-defense narrative falls apart completely. That's not someone afraid for their safety. It's someone preparing to assault and kill. The defense brought in a clinical and forensic psychologist who testified that Abram had suffered from major depressive disorder and psychosis, but was still legally fit to stand trial and understand the charges against him. The state of Mississippi uses something called the Manhattan Rule to determine criminal insanity. Basically, the court asks whether the defendant's mental state was so broken that he didn't understand what he was doing, or if he did understand his actions, whether he knew they were wrong. It's an incredibly high bar to clear because the legal system doesn't want people escaping responsibility by simply claiming their brain made them do it. In Abram's case, that handwritten to-do list made it impossible to argue he didn't understand his actions. Someone who can write detailed instructions, rent a car from a specific location, fill containers with gasoline, and time their arrival for a specific hour clearly understood cause and effect, planning, and execution. Before all of this happened, Martez Abram had worked at the Southaven, Mississippi Walmart for 20 years. 20 years is a significant chunk of someone's life. It's longer than most marriages survive, longer than most people stay in the same house or maintain the same friendships. He had worked his way into some kind of supervisory role over those 2 decades, which in the world of retail doesn't mean much in terms of pay or prestige. But it does mean he'd stuck around longer than the constant rotation of younger employees who quit after a few months. His neighbors described him as quiet and nice. Dartha Lafayette lived nearby and would see him leaving for work around 4 in the morning as she was coming home from her overnight shift. Kevin Ivey, another neighbor, said the man seemed real cool and quiet, which made the shooting incredibly shocking when it happened. However, about a week before the shooting, something happened that changed everything. Abram had a confrontation with a subordinate employee and was called into the manager's office to discuss it. And according to sources, he had walked into the store with a hunting knife in his belt and shown it to an employee during some kind of dispute. So the employee was concerned enough to report it to management, though he didn't want to press criminal charges. He just wanted the incident documented in case something else happened later, which actually happened. Abram was suspended pending an investigation into the incident, which is standard corporate procedure for that type of workplace conflict. They probably figured the suspension would give him time to cool off, that he'd come back in a few days after the investigation concluded, and everything would return to normal. However, Abram wasn't cooling off during his suspension. Rather, he was getting angrier, and that anger was turning into a detailed plan for revenge.
Madam Clerk, if you'll please read the verdicts out loud.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Martez Terrell Abram, guilty of capital murder in count 1. We, the jury, find the defendant, Martez Terrell Abram, guilty of capital murder in count 2. We, the jury, find the defendant, Martez Terrell Abram, guilty of attempted murder in count 3.
On the morning of July 30th, 2019, around 6:30, he drove his rented Kia Soul into the parking lot of the Southaven Walmart. It was 3 minutes later the first 911 calls started coming in. Police responded 3 minutes later, and by that point, 2 Walmart managers were already dead or dying. 40-year-old Anthony Brown had been shot in the parking lot before he even made it inside the building. 38-year-old Brandon Gales was shot inside the store itself. Both men died from their gunshot wounds. At the time of the shooting, approximately 60 Walmart employees were inside the building starting their morning shifts, stocking shelves, preparing registers, doing all the routine tasks that keep a massive retail operation running. None of them expected their Tuesday morning to include watching their coworker execute their managers. Carlos Odom was visiting his cousin who worked at the Walmart that morning. It was a routine visit he'd made plenty of times before, just stopping by to say hello before starting his own day. He'd just left the building and was walking to his car when he heard the shots. Odom would later describe the sound to reporters as shots fired in rapid succession, more than a dozen in total. He said when police officers ran into the Walmart, you could hear more gunshots from inside the building. Then everything went quiet. The silence after gunfire is its own kind of violence, the way sound suddenly stops and your brain struggles to process what just happened. Phil Cox was 70 years old and had just finished buying nasal spray, something so mundane it just shows how quickly normal life can turn into life-threatening chaos. Cox was in the parking lot heading to his car when he heard what he initially thought was a single gunshot. So he turned around and saw a man sprinting into the store entrance, moving fast, maybe 40 feet away from where he was standing. Cox would tell reporters later that he and his wife were within milliseconds of being much closer to the shooter, that they could have been walking right toward him when he opened fire, and could have easily been in the line of fire themselves. He said once they'd had time to process what happened, it was alarming to realize how close they'd come to being victims themselves. Travis Jones had been working the overnight shift, stocking shelves and organizing inventory, the kind of repetitive physical work that lets your mind wander while your body goes through familiar motions. Jones heard the shots and his first instinct was to run, and as he fled toward the exit, he saw Anthony Brown's body on the floor. Jones would later tell reporters that what happened wasn't an accident, that Abram knew exactly what he was doing when he walked into that store. He described the scene as ugly, which is the kind of massive understatement people make when they're trying to describe something their brain doesn't want to fully process or remember in detail. Jones had worked with both victims. He called Brandon Gales his best friend, someone he'd known for years through the daily grind of retail work.
Brandon was the most loving and caring, hardworking young man that I know, and he truly loved his family. Brandon would work long hours at Walmart, but it's also the place where he lost his life.
Brandon Gales was a father of 3. He'd worked at Walmart for approximately 16 years and had recently been promoted to department manager, a small step up the retail ladder that probably came with minimal extra pay but represented recognition for his years of service. Anthony Brown had 2 children waiting for him at home. Both men showed up for work that morning, expecting another ordinary Tuesday. Another shift of dealing with customers and managing employees and handling whatever minor crises pop up in a store that size. Instead, they were shot dead by someone they'd worked alongside for years. When Southaven police officers arrived and confronted Abram outside the Walmart, he shot at them. One took a bullet, but his bulletproof vest stopped it from penetrating and saved his life, suffering only minor injuries from the impact. The second officer wasn't having it. He returned fire and shot Abram twice, taking him down for officers to subdue and arrest. He was later transported to Regional Medical Center in Memphis for emergency surgery to treat his gunshot wounds. But while officers were securing him, they discovered that a fire had been set inside the Walmart, part of his plan to destroy evidence of what he'd done. So officers ended up spending hours inside the Walmart that morning, moving carefully through aisles and back rooms, checking every corner. Someone had found a suspicious package, which meant they had to call in the bomb squad to make sure it wasn't going to explode. The store had already seen 2 murders and a fire, and nobody was taking chances on what else might be waiting for them. Meanwhile, the 60 employees who'd been working that morning got herded out to the parking lot of the Chili's restaurant next door. Detectives set up shop there and started pulling people aside one by one for interviews. These employees sat there for hours, giving their statements, answering the same questions multiple times, waiting for someone to tell them they could finally leave. Some of them were still wearing their Walmart vests. Some were crying. Others just stared at nothing, trying to make sense of what they'd just seen. A few formed small circles in the parking lot and prayed together while they waited. Because what else do you do when your workplace turns into a crime scene? However, the community didn't waste time responding.
He was laying on the ground with his eyes open, full of blood, and I ran up to him. I kneeled down, and I looked at him, I said, Anthony, honey, please say Casey one more time. Just say Casey one more time.
Mayor Darren Musselwhite told reporters this was a sign of the times that had brought deep sadness to the whole city of Southaven. But it also hit him personally too, because he'd known Anthony Brown, the store manager who got shot in the parking lot. When someone you know gets killed at work by a longtime employee, it stops being just another news story. Later, when the case went to court, Mississippi Supreme Court Justice David Ishii watched the surveillance footage from that morning and described what the cameras captured in cold, factual detail. The video showed Abram gunning down one co-worker in the parking lot, then entering the store and shooting another victim inside, starting the fire, then emerging from the building to shoot at police officers who just arrived. 2 murders, 1 arson, 1 attempted murder of a cop. All of it happening in about 10 minutes, all within roughly 100 yards. When you put the surveillance footage together with what witnesses saw and what Abram himself admitted to at trial, it became obvious this wasn't someone who snapped in the heat of the moment. This was someone who'd spent days planning exactly how to kill his managers and destroy the evidence. After the shooting, Abram was rushed to a hospital in Shelby County, Tennessee. Police had shot him during the standoff that ended his escape, and within 2 days, his condition was stable enough for questioning. Investigators wanted answers, but he was already talking through his lawyer. There, he made it clear he wouldn't go back to Mississippi willingly. He knew what waited there. 2 dead Walmart employees, a trail of witnesses, and capital murder charges that almost always end in death row. However, state politics move faster than personal resistance. In early September 2019, Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant signed the extradition order, and Tennessee's Governor Bill Lee approved it soon after. And once both signatures were in place, Abram's objections didn't matter. He was going back to face trial in the same state where it all began. So by December 2022, the case had reached its sentencing phase. For the victims' relatives, it was the end of a long and public grief. But for Abram's family, it was a different kind of loss, mourning a man still alive, but no longer the person they knew. His sister Monique told the court their parents had raised them to know God and to reject violence. She said the brother who did this wasn't the one she'd grown up with. Over the years, he had slowly cut himself off from his family, isolating in ways that, looking back, made sense only after the tragedy. When the death sentence was announced, another family member, Michelle Parks, called it one of the worst things that had ever happened in his life. You know, the families of offenders rarely get sympathy, but their pain runs parallel because they lose someone too, even if for different reasons. Once the trial ended, Abram's legal team began the appeal process. That's standard in capital cases. Every argument gets tested, every detail picked apart. His lawyers claimed the court had made mistakes by admitting evidence found away from the crime scene, weapons and ammunition from his apartment, and more guns from his pickup truck parked at Memphis International Airport. They said none of that had a direct link to the shooting itself, and also argued that the prosecution shouldn't have used the fire Abram had set as the basis for a capital murder charge, since he hadn't been formally charged with arson. The appeal moved forward slowly, like most death penalty reviews. Each claim had to be reviewed, each decision defended. What followed was the drawn-out machinery of justice, cold, methodical, and unstoppable once it starts. However, the judges weren't buying what Abram's defense team was trying to sell. They looked at the ammunition police pulled out of Abram's apartment and noticed it matched the exact caliber used in the shooting. That connection wasn't coincidental. Then there were the guns police found in his truck at the airport. However, the real problem for Abram's appeal was that the jury had already watched surveillance footage of him shooting his managers. They'd heard him admit to it on the witness stand. So even if the judges agreed that some evidence shouldn't have been shown to the jury, it didn't matter because there was still a mountain of other proof that would have gotten him convicted anyway. The prosecution wasn't about to let the appeal gain any traction because they came back arguing that they didn't even need the evidence his lawyers were complaining about. They already had his handwritten to-do list, had the spare gasoline jug in the rental car, even the body armor he wore. It was then the Mississippi Supreme Court looked at all of this in August 2025 and sided with the prosecution. They said the evidence from his apartment and the airport was completely relevant because it showed this wasn't some spontaneous breakdown.
The fact that they were there within 3 minutes saved multiple lives. I have no doubt about that. Had this man been allowed to get to his car, he had an AK-47, a ballistic vest, multiple rounds, and I do believe he intended further harm. So first, let me make sure that the first thing I will always say is that the reason why DeSoto County is safe, and it's a good place to live and a safe place to live, is because of our law enforcement, who take the safety of our citizens as their number one job. And you heard the testimony, if you were in there, that they were there to secure that position and to save lives and to eliminate the threat.
Abram's lawyers also took a shot at Mississippi's rules for determining whether someone's too mentally ill to be executed. They argued the state needed to modernize how it handles cases involving severe depression and psychosis, like what Abram had. But Mississippi has been using the same test for criminal insanity for over 100 years, and courts really don't like changing standards that have been around that long. If it was true and he had those problems, that didn't stop him from understanding what he was doing or knowing that killing people was wrong. The list destroyed any chance of an insanity defense working. Here's what makes Abram's case so unsettling. Before this happened, he had zero criminal record, not a single arrest, no history of violence, no pattern that would have warned anyone he was capable of executing 2 people. He'd just been showing up to work at the same Walmart for 20 years, doing his job, living a quiet life according to his neighbors. Then something snapped during those 72 hours. He went from long-term employee to military-style assault veteran. Nobody knows exactly how he got all the guns because the trial never fully explained where they came from. But he had a plan in motion and followed that plan exactly. By November 2023, Mississippi's death row held 37 condemned men waiting for execution, and today, he sits among them. With his case more or less closed, the facts are undisputed, and he's waiting for the state to pick a date to execute him, just like the other condemned men waiting their turn. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps Last Cell Chronicles keep telling real death row stories, because every cell has a story.